the most important video I've ever made. And it's about Australia's biggest business. Now, if you're a friend to our group or a friend to Australia, I ask that you please watch to the very end to find out the truth about Australia's biggest money spinner. Beautiful Blood, how CSL became a global success story. And this article was published 4 years ago in the Sydney Morning Herald. Now, this is no, fakery on my part. If you've watched my videos before, you'll know that, I remain reasonably composed when reading out these sorts of stories. But I just, as I started this recording, felt I was very surprised. I felt rather emotional. And perhaps that's because I'm feeling a bit anxious, actually, and that's not very common for me. And the reason I am is because of just how important this video is. If you've been following the campaign for justice for victims of Australia's deadliest medical scandal, contaminated blood, then let me assure you, this would have to be the most important video I've ever attempted to make in my life. And I'm nearly 50 years of age, and that's why I'm making it. I started campaigning for infected blood young. And I'm getting old, I'm losing function, the hair's going grey and all the rest of it. And actually, you know what? It's starting to feel a bit sad, because still we don't have any justice for victims of Australia's worst treatment scandal. I'm talking about haemophiliacs. Okay, I'm talking about 1,750 haemophiliacs who were infected with HIV and hepatitis C in Australia, and 1,400 of them having died. And we have survivors in our group who are fighting cancer, liver cancer, HIV and hepatitis C, and the ravages that that's had on their bodies over the years, not to mention on them financially and on their loved ones. They didn't get any assistance. Unlike haemophiliacs around the world, Australian haemophiliacs are the forgotten victims of the world's worst medical scandal. Now, recently, the Queen, it was announced that on her Queen's birthday honours list, that some Australian health officials had been recognised for their work, and that was something of a slap in the face to those of us who'd suffered under these lockdowns or lost family members due to the increase in suicide rates, or people who'd otherwise had adverse events. And it reminded me of how Australia promotes its health leaders, its health chiefs. It's basically one big story of success. They can do no wrong. So let me give you an example. This is the man who is responsible for creating the haemophilia treatments that we use, that introduced into Australia from 1978 onwards. And they'd been in the UK years prior. This was a mass pooled blood product called Factor VIII. And in Australia, it was made from as many as 7,000 different blood donors in this one unit of this Factor VIII product, which would be injected into the patient. And many of these patients were children, and they would not have died without this treatment. Okay, for many it was a lifestyle treatment, maybe to stop unsightly bruising or joint issues, that kind of thing. Okay, so many parents were persuaded to take this new wonder drug that had been made around the world, was being promoted around the world by pharmaceutical companies and blood products companies like this one, CSL. So let's start this story from 4 years ago, shall we? Beautiful Blood, how CSL became a global success story. Peter Schiff spent much of his life donating blood to the Australian Red Cross. He started giving blood in 1953 as a medical student in Sydney and continued until recently. What a good Samaritan. So it's fitting that the 83-year-old's investments in the blood business, he was one of CSL's early investors when the company listed on the Australian Securities Exchange in 1994, have made him a small fortune. Okay, so this company CSL, formerly known as the Commonwealth Serum Laboratories, and they were formerly owned by the Australian government until a very suspicious sale, it must be said, in 1994. Now, anyone involved with the infected blood inquiry overseas, or anyone who knows anything about the haemophilia issue, knows that a lot of these blood products companies were mixing blood. And they were, for example, the United Kingdom has a voluntary blood donation system like Australia does. It's strictly forbidden to pay for blood donations. And it's also not advised to take blood from donors who are unhealthy or might be at greater risk of infection. And yet, these voluntary donation systems, like the United Kingdom, actually imported blood that had come from systems that weren't made up of this altruistic voluntary donation style system. No, they brought it in from all sorts of places, from prisons overseas in the United States, from paid donors in the US, and in Australia's case, they were bringing it in from Asia. They were bringing in blood from Asia and mixing it into our blood supply, into these blood treatments, okay? And they were bringing it in from jails and other places. And as I'm about to show you soon, they were also appealing for blood donors who read sexually explicit publications during the HIV crisis. Now, this is a really interesting little part of Australian history, okay? So here's this man, Peter Schiff, that the Sydney Morning Herald is saying, isn't it, they're saying, it's fitting that the 83-year-old investments in the blood business, and he was one of CSL's early investors, it's fitting that it's made him a small fortune. Okay, so he's probably been given a title by the Queen as well. I think if you find out, if you look, he probably has, right? He'd have the Order of Australia. They all do. They all do, okay? All right, now let's have a look at what Peter Schiff had to say in 1984. Now, this is in my evidence, Charles Mackenzie's evidence, my witness statement, which was published in on the Infected Blood Inquiry's website. I was made a witness. I was asked to assist the inquiry, and I complied with their order. And it was my great privilege to do so, principally on behalf of the long-suffering victims and their loved ones of Australia's worst treatment scandal. And I speak of haemophiliacs. I've had many as friends, and I've lost many as friends. And they are on my mind every day, and have been on my mind every day since I found out about a young boy who went to my school, okay, who developed AIDS after receiving one of these blood treatments, and he was given it for some bruising, and his parents were desperate for help. AIDS was a very scary disease, very new. Doctors didn't know what to do. What on earth would the victims know what to do? And they needed help, anything at all, because it was so difficult to manage. And the Australian government wouldn't even give as much as $100 a week to help with the home nursing or any of those costs. And so the boy who went to my school, who acquired HIV and developed AIDS from these blood treatments made by Peter Schiff's CSL, okay, his parents went to court to try and get help, and he died. He died during that court case. And they lost that case. They lost it principally because they didn't have evidence like this. And here I am, a former pupil of St Andrew's Cathedral School, and I say this on behalf of the little boy known as H. His name was protected by the courts, and for legal reasons, I will not give his full name. H died in 1989, and I read this in his memory, the truth of how he died. I am aware of a report of a meeting of the BTS Executive Subcommittee held in Canberra, that is the capital of Australia, on the 23rd and 24th of February 1984, which stated, Dr. Schiff reported that the heat sterilisation currently being evaluated at Commonwealth Serum Laboratories resulted in a fall in yield of factor rate of about 40%. As overseas manufacturers claimed losses of only 15%, Commonwealth Serum Laboratories was investigating other methods in an effort to find a more satisfactory process. He said that at present, pressure from interested groups for a heat-treated factor rate concentrate was not at a level where an immediate solution was required, although haemophiliacs would like to have a product available in Australia as soon as possible. The committee urged that no decision be taken hurriedly on a matter which would have such far-reaching consequences for the blood transfusion services, such as markedly decreasing the amount of factor VIII available for treatment, while at the same time increasing the cost of both plasma collection and processing. Now, to those of you who know about haemophilia, to those of you who've lost loved ones, all right, or lost friends as I have, you'll know what this is. This is evidence of crime from Dr. Peter Schiff and this BTF subcommittee and this Commonwealth Serum Laboratories. To those of you that do not understand that it's a crime, I will do my level best to explain. This treatment that was used by haemophiliacs, it wasn't a blood transfusion. Whole blood, as it's known, blood transfusions, they're often given to people who, say, might be in a car accident. You might be fighting for your life. You're going to die without that blood transfusion, okay? This isn't that. This is a treatment, a drug, right? It makes, a lot of haemophiliacs, they didn't even know exactly what went into making this drug, right? Because they were just assured it was safe. It was only after Australia's worst treatment scandal and 1,400 haemophiliacs dying that people started to ask real questions, right? Now, this product, as I said before, was made up of thousands of donors. Now, they knew, CSL, as did the collectors of the blood, the Australian Red Cross Lifeblood, that if just one of those donors was infected with something like hepatitis or HIV, okay, then in all likelihood, that product, factor VIII, the entire batch, would be contaminated. So they put these donors' blood in a big batch, and they make this factor VIII, and every single factor VIII that would have gone to all these haemophiliacs would have been contaminated by hepatitis or HIV. Now, what many companies and blood products makers were doing around the world and health authorities around the world were doing was they were actually successfully using what was called sterilization techniques or heat treating techniques. And what they knew was that you could use various, sterilization methods. You could heat treat, for example. You could actually, now you can't do this with whole blood, right? Because you kill the beneficial red cells, the hemoglobin within that blood. But haemophiliacs aren't needing that. Their blood is normal, except for this missing protein. And what you can do, therefore, is you can actually heat this protein, right? This blood plasma, this factor VIII, and you won't kill off all of the protein. It will still have great value. And even better news is it won't have HIV or hepatitis with it, right? There's no Hep B, there's no Hep C, these deadly viruses aren't there. And so what a lot of countries around the world were doing was they were heat treating. Now, of course, we could have actually imported these heat-treated factor VIII products, and we had that provision within our system, our health system in Australia, called a special access scheme, where in the event that we weren't providing a medicine because we didn't produce it or it was too costly to make or whatever, we could import it. But CSL and the Australian government didn't do that in the case of factor VIII. And what we have here is we have Dr. Peter Schiff saying that this heat sterilisation that was being used successfully overseas, okay, was resulting in a fall of yield. Now, what that means is that this liquid, this plasma liquid, okay, they're losing some of it because it's evaporating, presumably, in this heat treatment. And they're saying that, they're losing so much of it. And quite frankly, he says also, there hasn't at present been pressure from interested groups. Hasn't been enough pressure from interested groups. Who's he speaking of? Do you think he might be speaking of the Haemophilia Foundation, perhaps? Or from people interested in haemophilia? Okay, because he's saying there hasn't been pressure for an immediate solution. Well, that can't be right. It's 1984. This is the peak of the bloody HIV, excuse my French, the HIV crisis. Okay? The worldwide media was alight with all of this around the world. And so what on earth are they talking about? And it says here, there's no, the situation is not at a level where an immediate solution was required, although haemophiliacs would like to have a product available in Australia as soon as possible. Why would those haemophiliacs have wanted to have a product that was heat treated as soon as possible because they knew that they were at risk of getting AIDS, is why. They'd seen what was happening around the world. They knew their lives were on the line. And look at the response from Peter Schiff. Hey? The committee urged that no decision be taken hurriedly on a matter which would have such far-reaching consequences. Oh yeah, could you imagine if it was their children, hey, on the end of this stuff? Can you imagine? This is murder. 1,400 Australian haemophiliacs were killed by this. And let's have a look. They were so tight that they didn't want to heat treat, right? Presumably because the blood was just, oh, so safe, no need to heat treat. Now let's have a look at where CSL and the Australian Red Cross were getting this blood from that they were using to make for this treatment for haemophiliacs, with so many of them being children, like the kid from my school that was killed. Have a look at this. Prison blood donors, okay? Warning on disease about these prisons. Here you are, off to Pentridge, yeah? Remember, Chopper Reed was in that notorious place down in Victoria. Bad blood lingers over jail donors. Look at this. Australian Red Cross and CSL refuse available screening for deadly Hep C virus in 1978. Look at that. Hey, 1979, there's an outbreak of hepatitis. It's reported in Sydney among homosexuals by the gay newspaper, the Sydney Star, who are frustrated by a lack of response, right? And you know what happened? Hey, the Australian Red Cross didn't, and the government didn't send any help. They sent blood vans. They didn't help them, they sent blood vans. Okay? And then in 1980, reports of HIV starting to be transmitted. Of course, it was under a different name in those days, right? Okay, and then in 1982, now this might take a while to load, but in 1982, have a look at this, where the Australian Red Cross lifeblood, okay, they collected blood to send to CSL, which would be made into this factor VIII treatment. Let's have a look at where they were advertising for donors. Now remember, they're not heat treating, okay? Remember that? Because they said it would cost too much, there'd be a drop in yield. So they don't want to do that, right? So where would they get their blood donors? This is how serious they were about safety, this CSL, okay, and this Australian Red Cross. They were advertising, okay, in these sexually explicit publications. And the reason they were doing that was because they knew that people in the gay community, all right, would be at increased risk of hepatitis. I just showed you on the timeline that the editor of this very publication had very responsibly called on urgent help. In fact, they'd written a letter to the Premier of New South Wales, Neville Wran, saying, do something about hepatitis. And do you know what they did? They sent blood vans down and they said, right, let's start advertising for blood donors. There you are. Be a sport. And it also talks about how they can send a mobile blood van to you. And that sits above a bathhouse, a sexual bathhouse that was very well known. And it sits beneath a very well-known taxi club. Okay? And it's bookstore. It's a dirty bookstore, right? Nothing wrong with that. But in a time when they didn't have tests for hepatitis and HIV and all that kind of thing, there was something wrong in it, because people who, at that time, in the late 70s, early 80s, okay, who had Hep B, this is why the Australian Red Cross were collecting from people that they thought would have Hep B, because they used that blood to make a hepatitis B vaccine, because vaccines were blood-based back then, right? But anyway, as you can see, they were using the spare blood that they collected from sources like this to make this factor VIII treatment that, when we go back to this document, they're saying that they wouldn't heat treat, okay? There you go. Didn't want to heat treat. And then you can see above it, they're talking, here we go. Another thing I'm saying, this is a report of a meeting of the Working Party on Factor VIII and Factor IX concentrates. The meeting was held by the Australian Red Cross Society at Commonwealth Serum Laboratories on June 29, 1984. And this document links the Australian Red Cross Society with the Scottish Blood Transfusion Service, where at paragraph 2.3, the evaluation of heat treatment methods is explored. particularly concerning in this report is the statement that both Dr. Eckert and Dr. Rickard agreed they had no problem with liver disease, hence they would prefer to have sufficient concentrate for all cases rather than be short of concentrate because of heat treatment. Again, anyone who knows anything about haemophilia knows what this means. It's crime. For anyone that doesn't, let me explain. So these guys are saying, listen, if you heat treat this factor 8 product, there might be less factor 8 product for us to prescribe. And we don't have a problem with our patients getting liver disease because we'd rather that than there be a shortage of this treatment that many of them don't even need to survive. How outrageous. What on earth's going on? And can you believe that one of these doctors worked with children? Can you believe it? And can you believe that people like this actually would have injected children knowing where it came from? Okay? Knowing where it came from? That it could be from people that they were collecting blood to develop a hepatitis B vaccine, okay, that should have been donating for other purposes or even for that purpose. It was madness. No other blood bank in the world did things as crazy as this. But here we are. Beautiful blood, how CSL became a global success story. No wonder they were sold in such a hurry. And did you know the Australian Labor government of the day, did you know that they indemnified this company in 1994 before privatising them? And did you know that they knew that everyone that had used factor 8 had been infected with hepatitis C? In their own documents years earlier, it stated that. And yet they indemnified them and didn't warn. They knew that haemophiliacs who'd been hit with HIV just years prior, they knew that everybody had also been infected with this deadly virus, hepatitis C, that causes liver cancer, okay, liver cirrhosis. And we have survivors in our group fighting cancer right now. And unlike their British friends, okay, unlike haemophiliacs in England, they're entitled to no financial assistance. The only thing they're entitled to is a cover-up that's been killing them and killing their families for decades. And I've had enough.